It's pretty common knowledge that the chapter and verse numbering in the Bible isn't original to the text. Even people who barely study the topic know that those are later additions. Some lay people might even know part of the story. A simple Google search will tell you that they originated with Stephen Langton in the 13th century. Even biblical scholars cite this as common knowledge. But this is only partially true. Langton definitely played a big role, but it's not as big as one would think. In its original form, the biblical texts would have been written as long blocks of text with basically no punctuation. Obviously, this makes readings pretty complicated for modern English speakers, but ancient readers knew how to deal with it, because that's all they knew. Eventually, though, they needed to divide these sections. They could reference books, but without something like the current system of chapters and verses, it would have been very hard to navigate it even if you knew how to follow along. There were some pretty early systems of dealing with this issue that made referencing, cross-referencing, and citing way easier. Believe it or not, the earliest form of this started in the 4th century with the church father Eusebius of Caesarea. A lot of stuff is actually attributed to this guy. He wrote a massive history of the church, a biography of Constantine that absolutely had no bootlicking in it. He also is said to have been the one to interpolate the famous Josephus passage about Jesus. But the man also created this funky chart that we now call a Eusebian canon. The purpose and usage of this chart was given by Eusebius in his letter to Carpianus. He says that Ammonius the Alexandrian gave them a gospel harmony. Believe me when I say there's a lot to say about that. But that harmony was out of whack, as the cool people say these days. Doesn't matter to me that the Urban Dictionary entry was made in 2004. Ammonius's harmony aligned everything with the Gospel of Matthew, but since it was using Matthew's order, it ruined the sequential order of the other 3 Gospels. In order to remedy this, Eusebius made a series of reference tables that would give you parallel sections in each book. Ammonius had sectioned these off in what Eusebius calls pericopes. He made about 10 total tables that referenced each section of the Gospels and gave a parallel reference in the other Gospels. You would go to the proper table, the right number on that table, and then find the parallel accounts in the other Gospels. This was a very early form of a synopsis. And if you don't know what that is, it's a way to format the gospel side by side so you can read the parallel accounts. Here is my copy of a synopsis. As you can see, all of the accounts are paralleled side by side as they exist in the text. Now, I actually ordered a Greek one, but those f***ing idiots sent me an English one, and I've been mad about it ever since. Ammonius's version was probably closer, but it's a very useful tool for modern scholars, especially those trying to solve the synoptic problem. The thing is, it's unlikely that the reference tables, the Eusebian canons, were trying to parallel accounts with a different gospel account of the same story. Rather, he was paralleling similar stories. This is why the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are paralleled with John 1:1, even though John 1 has no birth story. So it's understood altogether as a section about the history of Christ. Eventually, though, this system got cumbersome too. Having to turn the pages back to the tables honestly kind of sucked, so the cross-references made their way to the bottom of the page in later manuscripts. In Codex Argentius, which is one of the coolest Bibles I have ever seen, the reference tables are given at the bottom of the page. Early manuscripts show the popularity of the practice of numbering sections. We're not quite at chapters yet, but we can definitely see the inklings of a more modern system. Let's take a look at Codex Vaticanus. This is one of the most important Greek witnesses to the majority of the biblical corpus, and it contains a similar numbering system. Matthew is divided into 170 sections, Mark into 62, Luke into 152, and John into 80. What's funny is that Bruce Metzger actually makes a mistake in his book, The Text of the New Testament, and says that there are 50 sections in John, but when I looked into it, the last section of John has a Greek letter pi next to it, which was the Greek numeral for 80. See, Mom, my degrees weren't a waste of money. In the same manuscript, the Book of Acts actually has 2 numbering systems. One of these divides Acts into 36 sections, and this one was original to the writing. The other one, written onto the pages by a later scribe, divides it into 69 sections, which is nice. Interestingly, Codex Sinaiticus actually contains the 69 section divisions as well. Even though this was written in the margins by a later hand, it still points to the 69 section divisions as having some popularity. In Sinaiticus, the numbering actually stops partway through, and no one really knows why, but the sections that were numbered matched the 69 section divisions in Vaticanus. But lest we think these were even close to being standardized, you should know that Codex Alexandrinus, another really important Greek manuscript dating to the 5th century, actually has about half as many sections among the Gospels as Vaticanus, but contains actual headings to those sections, the same way modern Bibles give chapter and section names before the text itself. That covers at least some of the Greek manuscript tradition, but the story is pretty cool in the Hebrew tradition as well. Our oldest complete manuscripts of the Old Testament are actually medieval. They date from around the 10th century and constitute what's known as the Masoretic text. This comes from a group of Jews that were tasked with copying this textual tradition, known as the Masoretes, or the Masters of the Tradition. The tradition itself began in late antiquity, but preserved complete Hebrew Bibles are from later. The Masoretic text didn't have a system of numbers, but there was definitely a way to tell verses and sections apart. They employed a system of gaps. Patua were large gaps from the end of a verse to the end of a line. Setuma were smaller gaps to show that the following verse was still part of the same division. However, these were not consistent between manuscripts. This parsing wasn't even consistently applied at Qumran, where we have discovered some of the oldest Hebrew manuscripts of many of the biblical texts. The ones at Qumran, known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls, date from the 3rd century BCE through the 1st century CE. The Hebrew texts also use a system of verse division, called Seluk, where they use an accent mark under the last word of a verse. Along with this, they use these 2 dots at the end of a verse to make the division even clearer, but these still weren't numbered. I'm sure these helped for reading, but they didn't do much to help for citations or referencing. You can see them both in this manuscript here, actually. What makes this interesting is that the Masoretes had verse totals, but not verse numbers, as pointed out by Penkower. I really recommend reading his papers that I've cited below, by the way. They're incredibly interesting. As we can see from all this, scribes had ways of dividing the text into sections and verses, but since these are so vastly different among textual traditions, we're a long way from solving our problem. When did we actually get numbered chapters and verses in the Bible? For this, we need to go to a totally different tradition, a few hundred years into the future. The Latin Vulgate, a Latin translation of the Bible, was first given to us by Jerome in the late 4th century. There had been translations of Latin before this, but they were restricted to passages or certain books. But Jerome gave us the first complete Bible in Latin. This served as the foundation for church Bibles up until the 16th century. It didn't have chapter numbers or verses, but the first instance of chapter numbering came to us through the Latin text. The significant change is often said to come from Stephen Langton and the creation of the Paris Bible. Langton taught in Paris schools in the late 12th century up until 1206 when he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. You might know him from something else though. He wrote the Magna Carta. Most Bibles up until this point in the 13th century were sold in volumes. The Paris Bible, on the other hand, was a complete, organized, and numbered text that became massively popular. The 13th century saw a huge spike in the production and ownership of complete Bibles. Many of these were also pocket Bibles, and that's exactly what it sounds like, a smaller, travel-sized Bible. So it's no wonder that the Paris text was so popular. Some of these actually had to omit verses or phrases just to make the text fit onto the tiny little page. It's clear that the work Langton put in was incredibly influential. These Bibles had chapter numbers, were complete and organized, and many were produced. It makes sense that Langton was credited with creating the entire chapter numbering system since it was so popular directly after his time. However, in reality, recent research shows that he was only the popularizer of this system. His attribution to being the creator of it started very shortly after his death, so scholars have really just been taking these at face value. Not 10 years after his death, a copy of the Latin Bible noted him as the originator of the chapter division of Genesis and Proverbs. Actually, I'm pretty sure I found the exact manuscript and page this is on. The writing in red here is called a rubric, and it was a common feature of Latin manuscripts. They would basically serve as headings for the section. And about 100 years after that, the Dominican chronicler Nicholas Trevette said Langton invented the whole system. Paul Sanger and Laura Bruck actually argue that the more modern system of chapter numbering began with codices prepared at St. Albans before 1200. They find an extraordinary amount of evidence for this. One of the key players in this history was the 8th century clergyman Alcuin of York. In his time working with the little-known King Charlemagne, he prepared an edited version of the Latin Vulgate that included chapter numbers. We only have copies of this text, and I think this is a copy of it from the 9th century, but you can see the numbers on the side. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a facsimile of the manuscript without spending $1,000 on Abe Books, and I'm not spending that much money on you. I need that money to buy a single t-shirt 3 years from now. In the 8th century, the Margramnus Bible also contained a numbering system before Alcuin. Interestingly, the numbering system of Alcuin was more popular with early Parisian and English manuscripts. Sanger and Bruck point out that Alcuinic versification appears in 12th century English Bibles, and in the 13th century it was ubiquitously employed, however, with greater standardization in Paris than in England. Some Bibles even contained both numbering systems, one in the headings and the other in the margins, such as this one from the early 12th century. Both numbering systems for the chapters are right there, and this was 100 years before Langton came along. Only one set of these are original, though. The more modern ones that would become part of Langton's copies were later added. But they weren't added by Langton, they were added by someone else from the 12th century, which means Langton wasn't the inventor of the system. Langton and the Parisian Bible tradition became the most influential pieces of the puzzle when it comes to modern Bible chapter numbers. But the story doesn't end there. In the mid-1400s, Rabbi Isaac Nathan was influenced by this chapter numbering and used it in his concordance of the Hebrew Bible. He employed the use of the Latin chapters and their Hebrew equivalents. He was the one that actually worked out verse numbers, but this practice wasn't as quickly accepted as the chapter numbering in Parisian Bibles. Both the 1487 Turenberg Bible and the 1520 Lyons Bible have chapter numbers and titles, but no verses. The 1517 Rabbinic Bible included chapter numbers, but no verses either. However, the tides would slowly begin to turn in the 16th century. The 1525 Rabbinic Bible had chapter numbers, but didn't base it on the 1517 version. Rather, the chapter numbers there were based on a 1523 Hebrew Bible concordance. The 1548 version actually numbered every fifth verse. According to Penkower, in this edition, the chapter beginnings in Rabbinic Bible 1525 that reflected a conflicting Vulgate verse division were corrected to reflect the Masoretic verse division. This created a situation we can still see today. If you compare a Hebrew Bible translation with a standard English translation predominantly used by Christians, you'll notice that some verses don't quite match up. Usually, this is just one verse off. Psalm 18 is just one of many examples where this happens. The Hebrew verse division makes their Psalm 18:7 equivalent to the English Psalm 18:6. It's representative of the same text, just one number off. And this is seen in countless places in the Old Testament. The thing is, these Bibles all contain commentaries to some extent or a parallel translation. So numbering the verses was necessary. The first Hebrew Bible published without translation or commentary to number every single verse was the 1659-61 Amsterdam Bible. Remember, these were published in volumes, so they didn't publish it all at once all the time. But the Amsterdam Bible became the standard edition for Hebrew Bibles up until the 18th century. However, the verse numbers here were still in the margins. It wasn't until the 1860 through 66 Rabbinic Bible that we got verse numbers at the very beginning of the verse in a fully Hebrew Bible. In the mid-1500s, Robert Estienne, otherwise known as Stephanus, became a popular publisher of Bibles. He introduced verse numbers into his publication of the Greek and Latin texts. He was actually working off the verse divisions of Paganus of Lucca, but he didn't agree with all of his verse divisions. The first English Bible to include verse numbers was actually the 1557 Geneva Bible, which covered the New Testament, and then the 1560 publication, which included the whole Bible. In his 1543-44 version of the Hebrew, he included chapter numbers, but not verse numbers. His Greek text was based on Erasmus's work, otherwise known as the Textus Receptus, but Stephanus was the first to include Greek variants in the margins. And on the Textus Receptus, I have a lot to say about that. In fact, I might make a whole other video about the Textus Receptus. I made a video about why the KJV sucks years ago, but you know what? I think I can do better, because now that I know more, I know that the KJV sucks more than I initially suspected. So I think doing a video on the history of the KJV, the Textus Receptus, would actually be very interesting, so I might have to do that later. But anyways, not too long after these publications came the second major polyglot text, the Biblia Regia, in 1569 through 72. Like other polyglot texts, it had parallel translations of the Bible in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. And it wasn't the first polyglot, but it was the first one to have both numbered chapters and numbered verses. As was the style at the time, the numbers were in the margins, but there were little crosses added at the beginning of every verse. You may think of all of this as being quite messy. Hopefully I did that joke right. I think that was a sports ball guy. I think I heard the name in sports ball circles. Sports ball. And you would be right. It is messy, but I'll summarize it this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was... Wait, no, that's the wrong one. In the beginning, the Bible didn't have verses or chapters. People began to parse it into sections for organizational and reference purposes. In around the 8th century, they started giving form to proper chapters with numbers and headings. And later on, verses became included to further help in citations. The numbering systems were sometimes inconsistent, and the differences in the Hebrew and Latin parsing of the chapters led to the differences in chapter and verse citations we often see in the Old Testament/Hebrew Bible citations we see today. The story of how the Bible got chapters and verses is pretty complicated. It's nowhere near the simple Google search answer, and I didn't even cover even close to anything. This is really only the bare bones of it. And there's a lot more to learn. But either way, I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like and subscribe. It really helps in the algorithm. If you would like to support us in other ways, we have t-shirts on Teespring and a Patreon page. And hopefully, we'll see you back soon.